Chapter 42. The Rattlesnake Belt. It was the spring of the year, and Ed's dad had asked him and Scott to do some fencing in the upper pasture. It meant lugging a 100-pound roll of barbed wire up the hill. Eddie cut a sapling and stuck it through the hole in the center of the roll. Then, lifting the ends of the sapling, he and Scott headed up the trail, being careful to keep it level so the 100 pounds of barbs didn't accidentally slide off onto either one of them. Scott carried a hammer and U-shaped nails called staples. Eddie tucked some wire pliers in his back pocket and carried the wire stretcher in his free hand. Some people have never used a wire stretcher. It's a medieval-looking tool that consists of a long wooden handle tipped with metal teeth. Partway up the handle is a short chain with a metal grip on the end. To stretch the wire, you pull it as far as you can by hand and grab it with the metal grip. You set the teeth of the wire stretcher into the fence post, and using the long handle for leverage, you stretch the wire out until it vibrates. While you hold it taut, your partner drives a staple around it into the black locust post. Most fences take 4 strands of wire. Ed and Scott had been back and forth over the same spot 3 times already, lugging the unwieldy roll of wire up over rocks and through the underbrush. They were on the last strand. Just as they were stepping across a downed tree, Scott heard a sound. It was one of those sounds you don't want to hear in the woods, a sort of buzzing sound. Some would call it a rattling noise. They dropped the roll of wire and leapt backwards. There, coiled perfectly under the bottom strand of wire, sat an enormous timber rattlesnake. Its triangular head was raised over the glistening diamonds on its back. The tail, sporting a long chain of bony rattles, was raised in the air and vibrated rapidly. Ed turned pale as he looked at Scott. They both realized the rattler hadn't just appeared. It had been sitting there all along as they hauled the wire up and down the hill. At any moment, it could have chosen to bite them, but it hadn't. As the first shock wore off, they stepped closer to examine the snake. It was huge, and it had recently shed its skin. The sunlight struck its scales, giving them an iridescent sheen. It really was a beautiful creature. Ed thought it would make an amazing belt. Gathering his nerve, he picked up the wire stretchers and approached the snake. With great care, he placed the metal teeth on the snake's head and pressed down with all his weight. He did it again. The snake continued to thrash around even though it was dead. Ed had seen that before, and he wasn't worried, but he and Scott still had a half-hour's work to do before heading down the mountain, and he didn't want anything to happen to his snake. He built an enclosure with rocks and dropped the rattlesnake into it. He capped it with a large flat stone, and then he and Scott went back to work. As they finished up and were heading back down the mountain, Ed stopped to pick up the snake. Without thinking about it, he lifted the flat stone and immediately leapt backwards. There sat the rattlesnake, coiled and ready to strike. These snakes are one hard thing to kill, he thought to himself. So he killed it again. For good measure, he pulled the wire pliers out of his back pocket and yanked the fangs out of the snake's mouth. Even if it came to life again, it wasn't going to bite him. When the boys got home, Ed skinned the snake and tacked its hide to a long board, being careful to stretch and salt it. Scott took the meat inside and fried some up for the boys. Coming from the mountains, they liked to brag that they ate snakes. After a few days, the skin was dry. Ed took it off the board and began to scrape it with his pocket knife. He'd found an old cloth Boy Scout belt. When the snakeskin was ready, he wrapped it around the belt and ran it through his mom's sewing machine. To finish it off, he took some black paint and a small brush, adding 2 reptilian eyes to the burnished brass of the buckle. It was a masterpiece. That summer, a van-load of affluent teenagers from New England passed through on a tour of Appalachian poverty. They'd heard of the work Ed's father was doing and wanted to meet him. One afternoon they climbed the hill to the old farmhouse. They sat in the shade, drinking well water out of mason jars, listening to stories of the work and the war on poverty. These city kids amused Ed and his brothers. They pitched a couple of tents in the backyard and prepared to spend the night. One of the guys raced to the house, breathlessly announcing that 2 chickens were fighting. When Ed went out to check, he saw an old rooster mating with a hen. He snorted and said, "Son, those chickens aren't fighting. They're doing just the opposite." One of the girls was a real beauty. Her name was Allison. Ed looked for chances to sit close to her and talk. When the time came for the group to leave the next day, Ed asked for her address. Over the next couple of months, Ed wrote to Allison often. Allison didn't write back as much. When Ed learned that a friend of his was driving north, he arranged to join him. They spent 2 days on the road before ending up in the high-class suburbs of New York City. Allison's father was an important attorney. They lived in a large home under spreading elm trees. Ed realized pretty quickly that he was in over his head. After a couple of days, it was time for Ed to head back to snake-eaten West Virginia. He left his Rattlesnake Belt and a piece of his heart with Allison. She handed him a blue shirt with pearl buttons. On the long road home, Ed pondered his adventure and came to a conclusion. Allison had gotten the much better end of the deal.